Hello. This is Dr. Mercy, and I am going to talk in response to the visit that was made by the British Prime Minister, Mr. Gordon Brown, on 4th March to the United States following the U.S. Black History celebrations. Mr. Gordon Brown, you talked about energy, healthcare, and you also talked about the new era of engagement which had just begun, and you also talked about protectionism versus globalization. You also mentioned that you had the desire that all the global children should go to school, bearing in mind that you were making the visit to the United States for the first African American president, and you also visited at the time when America had just celebrated the birthday for the civil rights activist Dr. Martin Luther King. And in your speech, it was 43 minutes long. And since I've mentioned you came at the time when we had just finished celebrating Black History Month, I was amazed that you did not even make mention of any importance or to acknowledge the birthday of this important figure in the U.S. Black History Month. What did you talk about when it came to the Africa or history of Africa? For Africa, you only took 2 minutes to talk about Africa, and when you mentioned Africa, you went on to talk about, refer to it as the poorest of the poor. Yes, indeed, you mentioned Rwanda, genocide. You also went on to talk about David's, the poem that was written of David's portrait. I was amazed, Mr. Prime Minister. You did not mention anything about the genocide in Darfur, and also the genocide that is going on in Zimbabwe due to the satanic sanctions that have been imposed on Zimbabwe, especially by Britain. Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned that you feel sorry, especially when you think of how classrooms are run down in Africa, and as you pointed out, that it's the poorest of the poor. You also mentioned that in Africa, more and more children are being lured to heavily funded madrasas, teaching innocent children to hate us. That's what you mentioned when it went to talk about Africa. I was surprised because I have never heard of the term madras, or where Africa is being heavily funded to teach children to hate people in what is called madras. Actually, I thought you said Mardi Gras, and I was like, are you talking of New Orleans? But from your facial expression, whatever Mardi Gras is, I think it shows some racism in it. Have you ever heard of the best friends model, where they say when you start talking of them versus us, that's spreading hate or racism? You mentioned that 17 million children do not go to school. Yes, millions do not go to school. And you went on to say, oh, perhaps one day they will learn of a great generation striving to make their freedom real. Prime Minister, how about the satanic sanctions that Britain has imposed on its former colony, Zimbabwe? Prime Minister Gordon, the cruelty that UK is imposing on Zimbabwe due to satanic sanctions is causing the outbreak of cholera, extreme poverty, chaos, shortages, and killing innocent blacks. And Mr. Prime Minister, I read on internet that Britain is moving, its aged white people, flying them from Zimbabwe to UK. At the same time, satanic sanctions are being imposed on Zimbabwe. You went on to mention that no power on earth should drive us apart. Since you are being a global leader, I assume you are telling the global village those words. But at the same time, I pause to ask, are you aware, or are you telling the world that it's okay to have the majority of blacks in Zimbabwe suffering because of the satanic sanctions? Let me just show you before sanctions. In Zimbabwe, this is what it was. In 1998, before sanctions were imposed, there was food. And today, as we speak, Prime Minister, this is what has happened to Zimbabwe. No food because of the sanctions. And here, Prime Minister, that's genocide due to these satanic sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. You also went on to say what makes a good society is shown by its wealth, banking system, children going to school, healthcare. We cannot stand aside when the poor are in agony. We must treat people fairly, and these are the good principles. You told the world that your family's sorrow is our family's sorrow. Look at the family in Zimbabwe. Due to satanic sanctions, things are not okay. Let's just look at the history and see what Britain has done to Zimbabwe. 1893, Britain invades Zimbabwe, takes cattle and land, and this woman here, Mbuyane here, she was hanged on the tree when she resisted. And then what happened here? We have roads. It was also sanctioning Zimbabweans. And then we had Ian Smith, who had false sanctions. And then Mugabe, when he tried civil rights so that equality would be there, satanic sanctions. And today we have Prime Minister Tsvangirai asking to have sanctions lifted, and it's not done at all. Britain today has 10,000 nurses from Zimbabwe. What is that, Mr. Prime Minister? That is not that is not fair at all. We are having child prostitution, hunger, rape. Zimbabwe sanctions are just as good as torture. So I am surprised even President Obama had to extend 1 year's sanctions when Prime Minister Tsvangirai had appealed to say, please lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe. Look at what is happening in Zimbabwe. The death toll, they can keep burying their people, and this is genocide, and they cannot even bury their dead, and because of the sanctions. And we are appealing to say, enough, this is not something. Why can't we honor that these two are working together? What is wrong with that when we have so many miseries in Zimbabwe, the British former colony? We also want to say thank you to Australia, which has given Zimbabwe, Tsvangirai and Mugabe's government the first donation of 10,000 Australian dollars. Thank you so much, Prime Minister, and we hope you will lift the sanctions on Zimbabwe. Thank you.